Welcome to On the Level, broadcasting from the Blue Ocean Network studios here in Beijing. My name is Fergus Thompson. Now, it's become something of a truism that China has lifted 400 million people out of poverty in recent decades. The phrase crops up anytime discussion of China's economic miracle takes place, whether it's in academia or the media. But a highly developed and modern high-speed rail system, a successful space program, a free-spending middle class, and enormous international economic clout don't necessarily mean that poverty doesn't exist in China. It does. Most of it centred on the country's rural hinterland. Well, to discuss the challenges facing those living in rural China, and particularly children growing up in the countryside, I'm joined today by Professor Zhang Linxiu. Professor Zhang is the Deputy Director of the Center for Chinese Agricultural Policy at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. She is also the Director of the Rural Education Activity Program, Project REAP, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. Dr. Zhang, Professor Zhang, thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to ask you first something of a personal question. How and why did you become interested in this particular issue, poverty and inequality and agricultural side of China?
I've been on the research field for 32 years. And since I graduated from Nanjing, I moved to Beijing and joined the research team. But since then, my focus will be agriculture and rural development. So after more than 30 years of both learning and studying and analyzing, we felt that although China had really developed so fast and then created the word miracle, we still have lots of issues on development that we need to tackle before China can continue its continued growth, high-speed growth.
Right. So this department, this center that you belong to, the Center for Chinese Agricultural Policy, that's under the Chinese Academy of Sciences. What does this actually do? What's the purpose of this entity? Actually,
we're going to get in 20 years next year. We established in 1995.
Okay.
Actually, it was by our director. He got his PhD overseas, and he also thought that China needs an organization first who could, bridge the dialogue between China and the world in terms of agricultural rural development studies.
Okay.
And secondly, we believe that we can find solutions for our own agricultural rural development problems. So we set up that focus of our center is looking at agriculture and rural development policy studies. But at the same time, we we introduce rare growth study methodologies and approaches to work on China. So basically, it was there was a need for a a scientific and systematic study of agriculture and rural development policies. And the first hand from a methodological point of view, and secondly, we would also think China needs evidence and empirical-based studies to come up with good ideas and advices on how policies could be improved and shaped in the future.
So you're looking at the policies, at what works and what doesn't work, and then advising the government afterwards, this is what you should do, what you shouldn't do.
That was it, yeah.
Right.
So
what are those problems that you're coming up against? What would you perhaps say is the main problem facing people growing up in rural China?
It's really a broad question. I don't know where to spend. So from my center's point of view, we have 4 areas of studies. First, we look at the agricultural science and technology policy because that's linked to agricultural development and productivity. And second, we look at the natural resource and environmental policy where could be a promoter and could be a limitations to the development. The third area we're looking at really the rural-urban integration, because you really need to have a balanced development between rural and urban, then you understand what the real bottleneck is. Of course, we are a policy research center. We focus on decision support systems, using the evidences and good practices and to inform the policy makers and what can be done, what should be done, and how to improve. So that's in general about our center.
Right.
Earlier you talked about, I'm the co-director of a program called Rural Education Action Project. We have 4 themes of the Center for Chinese Agriculture Policy. This is just one of the programs. We're looking at rural-urban integration. So under the big urbanization move and the globalization move, and how best and each individuals and fit into the system, how they can share share the benefits of the growth. So that's where the Rural Education Action Program is rested.
Right.
But in terms of the research, actually, social studies in the past, we are already a step ahead looking at the empirical facts to inform the policy levels. So with the Rural Education Action Project, we focus more on action.
Right.
So when we identified issues, we find the possible causes or the reasons behind it, and we test it. So we started looking at what can work to solve the problem, what does not work. And then actually the results and the policy recommendation could be really tested on the ground, and we know more sure what works, what doesn't work. So that's the difference between the early stage of our study. We do data collection, analyze it, but later on we do fact findings, but also we test solutions. So that's the action research part of it.
And one thing that you mention again and again in articles that have been written by the Rural Education Action Project, indeed in Caixin magazine here, is inequality, the inequality that faces those growing up in the countryside compared to the cities. Now, for many people in the United States and Europe, the countryside is a wonderful place where you want to live in your dreams after you finish work. In China, the reality is very different. What sort of challenges face people in the countryside here, and how unequal are they in comparison to those growing up in the cities?
Everybody knows China has a huge inequality between rural and urban. But most cases, people would use income as an indicator. It says, okay, urban income is 4 times more than rural income, so the gap is widening. But actually, income is just a comprehensive kind of, it's the consequence of sets of other root causes of those.
What are those
so
causes?
I think one of the key is really the human capital. So that's where our Rural Education Action Program, looking at how we can pave the road for the rural people to have their education dreams, for example, to succeed or advance as much as they could there. So that listed whether they are properly kind of housed in school, whether the school equipments were good, and how the school curriculum are. But we're also looking at forgotten kind of barriers that really kind of prevent rural kids to advance in their education. For example, one is lack of nutrition. So for example, if you're not well fed, how could you study well? You cannot really even concentrate. The other is really the huge digital divide, where the urban kids, when they are 2 or 3 years old, they start playing with iPad. But for the rural kids, probably up until their middle school, they don't have the access to those things, and their computer skills were large behind. So, and the other really areas are like, because China has, 9 years compulsory education. So the government target is that really at least 98% of the rural of the kids should complete this compulsory education.
That's up to the end of middle school.
Up to the middle school. That's junior high school.
Right.
That's 9 years. But on average level, we probably got 2 or 2.5% of dropouts from those the statistic, national state. But we know there's huge barriers for the rural kids to advance their education. Even the tuition fee were free for compulsory education. There's still a lot of costs involved. So we did a study, and we followed many kids in many schools in the poor areas. We found that school dropouts of middle school was as high as 30%. Which is huge. So the other program we had, how to keep kids in school.
Right. So
we have 3 programs within REAP. One is health and nutrition education. Second is human, IT technology and human capital. The third is keeping kids in school. Those are the 3 main themes of our action research.
Well, the problem is that the education, if you put it in a nutshell, is not as good in the countryside as it is in the cities.
Right. Yeah.
Why is it not possible simply to pump money into these countryside schools from a central level? What is the problem with that? Because China is not a poor country overall anymore. Is there some problem with that?
I don't think there's a problem. So I think the central government is already, first they committed more money, 4% of GDP into education. So that's the first step. And second, they're also trying to favor in the countryside by pumping more money. But I think the question is, pumping money is not the solution. The key is how best you use that money for. What are the priority areas you should put money into? For some of the things that market can take care and individual household can take care, I think the government money should not go. But other cases, the government money should cover. So it's really the question of two. One is to get more resources to the countryside, but more importantly, how best those resources should be used.
And
that's
you're saying
the areas.
You're saying the best use would be those three areas that you mentioned, which is improving nutrition, the digital side of things, and keeping kids in school for longer.
Well, those are things that, because those are the areas of our research program, but how best the money is used in this program. For example, one thing I would highlight, which really, to me, it's a success of many people's efforts, including us, because we thought that school nutrition was a problem because that really limit kids' learning ability in the school. So in the year 2011, Chinese government launched the school nutrition program, which is really the first kind ever that the Ministry for Education start looking at nutrition issues, which had been in the past in the traditional should be the health issues rather than education issues. So that was something we wanted to push for. But I think the things go beyond go like nutrition issues go way before the school age.
Well, let's look at the nutrition side of it, because that's something that people outside of China might be quite surprised with.
Right.
As I said, people have this image of modern China, a city with shimmering buildings in Shanghai, a huge, great infrastructure in this part of the eastern part of the country. What are the problems? Are we talking about kids that are not having enough to eat or getting the wrong foods? How is this affecting their schoolwork?
Actually, that the school age nutrition problem is mainly kind of micronutrient deficiency, specifically iron deficiency. So one thing we have to make clear is that kids in the rural areas don't lack of calorie. They can have enough calorie. But I think the combination of the nutrients are the key. So some places lack of vegetable vitamins, and other places lack of protein, and lack of meat, because meat has not only the protein but also micronutrient elements.
But is the problem here the problem isn't the cost of this food? Is it just the way that the traditional diet is formed?
Well, it was partially I think it's really complicated causes of that. Parents, traditionally, I still remember when I was a kid, I don't usually have meat every month, or maybe once or 2 or 3 times a year, those days. But I'm sure I was micronutrient deficient when I was a baby. But I was a kid. But now, when we talk about in this highly competitive society, everybody needs high IQ, to achieve whatever they could achieve in the school. So even you gave best teaching teachers and the best curriculum and best kind of laboratories, but if kids are micronutrient deficient, especially iron deficient, they cannot focus, they cannot concentrate, because the brain functions without enough blood and oxygen. So our study showed that anemia kid school performance was much lower than the normal kids. So when we added a micronutrient like an iron fortified tablet to them, after 5 months, they catch up very fast. So it's an issue. I think it's a hidden kind of a problem that when you talk about food security. And now the other background is a lot of kids, because of the school merger program in the countryside, a lot of kids are boarding in schools. So they eat school food. And school food, of course, 3 or 4 yuan subsidy is not enough to have meat, because that's less than a dollar. So I said earlier, we feel that we are so happy that the government really launched the school nutrition program now, but I think it's not sufficient, because they gave 3 or 4 yuan per person per day. And
what would you say that would be needed?
At least if for a nutritious food with meat and a balanced diet, you probably need 9 or 10 yuan. So I think on the one hand, adding 3 or 4 yuan subsidy is good for the children to have better resources for food. But on the other hand, you have a risk of crowding out the families. They said, school are providing food, so we don't have to supply anymore. So you have a mixed results right now. So we're in the process of evaluating whether the school nutrition program really provided additional nutrition to the kids, which I think it's 50-50%. So it depends on how you do. So a real school nutritious lunch, you need about 10 yuan to kind of make a balanced diet. So there's lots of way to.
I think another condition that has to do with health that you mentioned in some of these articles was the prevalence of worms amongst children in certain parts of the countries. Now this again is something that people would think, no, a country that is well on its way to development like China should not be suffering, and has a relatively simple cure.
Yeah.
How did you approach that?
We just finished a big, a large-scale randomized control trials and looking at how best we could tackle the intestine worm, problem in the school-age children. So we did it in Guizhou. So Guizhou, mind you, that the infection rate of the school kids were 35 to 40%, and some places were 80 or 90%, depends on where the locality. I think we knew that, when I was a kid, we always had deworming medicine annually from school, a collective deworming. But I think suddenly, for some reason, we never found a clear message when they did stop. I think on the one hand, we thought that, okay, families are rich enough, they can buy their own deworming medicine. First and second, all the conditions are improved because soil transmitted kind of worms that really comes with bad toilet, no flushing toilet, and no water to wash hands and those. And then on the one hand, Chinese economy developed in this stage, and those conditions were changed. In fact, in the poor rurals, they still using the traditional way, no flush toilets in a dirt mat kind of toilet, no water, tap water for washing the hands, and no things are still happening. So I think it's a miss, it's a miss kind of opportunity of that. So you've already said that 2 or 3 yuan or 4 or 5 yuan can cure the problem, but now it's not a public program. So the public health system has left those to the individual households. So we were trying to mobilize individual households, see how important to give deworming medicine to your kids, because changing the toilet facility, changing the housing in a dirt floor, that takes time. You need to have income, increase to a certain level to do that. But, having a kind of deworming practice, that's easy. But because it's individual action, we find it out, without public kind of push, it's very difficult to households to follow those through. So that's the challenge part.
These are some of the health issues. Another issue that you mentioned is children in the rural areas dropping out of school. You said up to 35%.
Yeah.
Why are they leaving school early, and why are they not doing the same in the cities?
So there are many, many reasons behind it. I think poverty is the first reason, because lots of those families who, kids drop out are the poor families. Keeping a kid in school, not only you need to pay tuition fee as an actual cost, there's also opportunity costs. Like if I don't send my kids to school, they can go to labor market. They earn 1,000 yuan or 2 a month. So poverty is still the first kind of reason. And second, there's also lack of interest from the school level, where there's.
You mean the school itself is not interested in its students continuing? Because
the school performance evaluation of the teachers normally comes with the average performance of the class. So if you have a lower performing kid, you're always worried that they lower down the entire average of the class. So you don't pay, we call those low performing kids, vulnerable kids at the school performance level. So they don't get much attention. So when we chase those who dropped out the kids, they said, even it's free, I would hate go back to school. And then my teacher hates me. I hate my teacher because they don't pay attention to me or something like. So there are lots of issues in the system, within the system, that need to be corrected. The other was actually they don't have a good sense about the career path. So nobody gave them career consultation or so on. So they also have, a stressful level of those low-performing kids or from poor families are much higher than the normal family kids. So all those contributed to those kids dropping out.
How do you tackle that?
We tackled that. First issue was that whether poverty was an issue. So we tried a intervention. We gave poor kids 1,000 yuan per year. Said, okay, if you go to school, we've subsidized your family 1,000 yuan a month, or a year, And if you keep your kids in school for more than 80% of the school time, we top you with another 500 as a reward, a bonus. Guess what?
These are significant amounts for a rural family in China.
Yes, but it's 1,000 yuan. So for us, it's nothing really for the urban people. And then look at the results. After a year, the school dropout reduced by 60%. So that was test of the first hypothesis, is that poverty is still a major kind of barrier. So that, based on that, we wrote a policy brief to the government. So that's the first. Actually, we used this as a conditional cash transfer because that's being practiced in the many developing countries to help the poor. So we used this in China. We proved that worked. So
that's money. But then in terms of the expectations of the teachers,
we also did life counseling, like we develop a school curriculum that's mainly a counseling program to the school. For the school, we assign the teacher to look at, to pay attention to a group of students. They gave consultative courses to them. If they have problem, they come to them. So we also proved that had significant impact on the kids who wanted to drop out.
Right.
Although the magnitude was not as big as giving them money, but still that was counseling helped to reduce the kids dropping out of the school, because that improved the teacher-student relations. Because one of the reasons was that I hate my teacher, I hate the school, and they don't pay attention to me. So we're trying to correct that relationship, improve that relationship, and it helped.
And finally, the lack of view of a career path.
We also did. We did a career training for the students and in the middle schools, and looking at also seeing that the future, like that had a limited amount of kind of impact. Right. It's not as great as money, as not great as counseling, but it had something. But we also had the other way of looking at the financial commitment. We gave the middle school kids, like if you are in the first year, we gave you early commitment for financial aid. So for example, if you succeeded to high school, we would help you to pay the tuition. So we look at we followed them all the way through. Actually, the early commitment helped reducing the school dropout. So which also shows that the financial barrier is one of the kind of issues that the kids to worry. So they say, if I couldn't afford to go to high school, why should I worry in staying in the middle school? So those are so we tested many of those hypotheses, possible causes, and all of those really proved to be the factors,
We hear a lot in the press and the media, particularly over the last few years, about what's called left behind children in China. Now these, to explain to people who may not be aware of this, are children whose parents have migrated to the cities, usually to seek a better economic life, and left their children behind, sometimes in the care of relatives, very often in the care of grandparents. It's something that is very visible in the media and has been talked about a lot, but you feel that these are not necessarily that there might be too much concentration on this particular section. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, I think we just had a Caixin column talking about left behind children. Are they the most vulnerable kids? Actually, they were the most vulnerable kids, but they were not the only vulnerable kids. So we argued that, okay, we compared many indicators among left behind children and children, both parents at home. So in terms of a nutritional level, in terms of a school performance, in terms of other kind of indicators you could name of those, left behind children do not do worse than the kids who are parents at home. In fact, they're doing better than the kids whose parents are home.
Any reason for that?
Who cannot get a job outside? Those are the parents who are vulnerable parents. Right. So those parents are at home, both are at home, I believe is the bottom of the poverty population. So I think if you have parents going out to
have
work,
that initiative of that extra income.
You have the income, which could be used to compensate some of the care. But there's one area that left behind children perform worse than others. That's the psychological behavior, the level of anxiety, the level of stress. And those kids are much higher than those whose parents are at home.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that. So what I wanted to argue is lots of attention paid to left behind children. I was worried about too much attention to one segment of the population. You forgot about those whose parents are both at home. So in fact, all the poor, the kids in poor rural areas are vulnerable kids, not just the only left behind children. Right. So that's the thing I wanted to argue. Yeah.
If you had one particular policy or initiative that you felt that the government, that you were allowed to implement, and that you feel that this would make more difference than anything else for these children in the countryside in China, what would it be?
I would think education, outcome of investing to education is a public goods. I should think that central government should take full responsibility for the compulsory education in all the rural areas, rather than shared responsibilities between central government and local government.
So at the moment, just to explain that this is the local government are responsible for some of the cost
in the central government. So more often the poor areas government are the much more resource constrained. So but the kids in those areas a greater needs.
Right.
So I think that's also solve part of the like migrant children's education problem, because the migrant children in the city areas always self-financing, go to private school. If those resources, subsidies are coming from central government, all the localities can take it up and then being paid by the central government. I think a lot of problems could be solved. And then the other one, I always argue in the different kind of circumstances, we should make high school as part of the compulsory education with rural, especially for rural kids, because they're the future labor forces, and then we need them to get better education. Anybody who doesn't have a high school education, I'm not sure in 10 or 20 years' time they can find a good job in the market. So
just to clarify, at the moment here in China, compulsory education, which is paid for in theory by either local or central government,
it's only 9 years, up to the middle junior high school. Yeah.
Changing tack slightly, you were last year chosen as one of the 10 most outstanding women in science in China by the Chinese Academy of Sciences 2013.
Yeah.
First of all, if I could ask you, does it say something that there is a special award to highlight women in science in China? Does that say something about the status of women in China?
I think so. I think, something you want to promote, you would always, give a flag to. So I think in general, in terms of gender balance between men and women, so I think the career path for men are much more smoother than women. So I think as a way to recognize the achievement of women, and they set up a special way. So there's obviously imbalance between men and women's participation in scientific community. So I think that's probably a way.
You work at quite a high level within the scientific community here. Is it something that's impacted you, or is it something that you have seen in general? Because you would say, I just tend to see whenever a scientist is mentioned talking about an issue in China, it is almost always a male scientist.
Yeah.
Is there a huge imbalance, do you think?
It is, especially at the higher level. So I think the junior level is fine, but I think that women bears more responsibility for social, generational task of having children or somehow. So a lot of family responsibilities are naturally assigned to women, which I don't believe should be all women, but women takes up. So in terms of the career, advancement, women are always being sidetracked. So in terms of the same level of competition, always men are really in favorite condition. That's why the gap become higher when you go upward.
But the situation at the moment in Chinese universities is, as far as I understand it, there are actually more women graduating from universities than there are men at the moment. So is this something that you see hope for change in the future, let's say 5-10 years?
Yeah,
or is
on the one hand, it's good you see women are advancing their education, but on the other hand, probably it's a delayed employment because of the gender discrimination in the job market. So I think it both ways, either a positive way or a negative way. I would have a mixed feeling of this. Yeah.
Professor Zhang Linxiu, thank you very much for joining us on The Level. I'm sure those future women scientists have a good role model in you.
Thank you.